Before getting started, we acknowledge that we are currently on Indigenous territories. The territories include the Wendat Nation, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. The treaty that was signed for this particular parcel of land is collectively referred to as the Toronto Purchase, and it applies to lands east of Brown's Line to Woodbine Avenue and north towards Newmarket. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land. So thank you everyone for coming today, both in person and those on live stream who have registered. It is exciting to have practices as far north as Kenora, as east as Windsor, east to Ottawa, and west to Windsor. Midwifery stakeholders at today's event includes the Association of Ontario Midwives and the Midwifery Education Program. As the newly elected president of the College of Midwives of Ontario, I wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about myself for those of you who have not met me. I have been on council for the past 7 years, 3 years as vice president, and currently year president since June. I am passionate about our college's vision to lead in regulatory excellence and our mission to serve in the public interest. In addition, I have been a practicing midwife since 2002. I am the founder of Uxbridge Community Midwives, and I have privileges and am head midwife at Markham Stouffville Hospital. I am also committed to working with the Midwifery Education Program to promote the education and training of future generation of midwives, to ensure that midwifery is safe and accessible. And I bring this dedication to safe and excellent midwifery care in the public interest to my role as council president. So today is an important member education day. We will hear 2 engaging presentations in the morning. First, we will hear from Deanna Williams, who will be speaking about the college's role in regulating midwives and the evolution of health regulatory colleges in Ontario since 1990s when the Regulated Health Profession Act came into force. We are also happy to be joined by Dr. Zubin Austin, a professor and inaugural holder of the Koffler Chair in Management at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. Dr. Austin will be presenting on competency and professionalism. And then, after lunch, we will be presenting on the college's proposed professional standards and asking for feedback from members gathered here today and those participating online. So I want to take this opportunity now to give you a brief update on the work that Council has been doing and to introduce you to the rest of your Council members. So can I ask the Council members who are in attendance to identify yourself when I call your name, please? We have Public Member Gemma Salamet, Professional Member Isabel Malo, Jan Teven, Public Member Jennifer Lemon, John Stashew, Professional Member Lily Martin, Wendy Mirko, Eden Thomas, and Public Member Sally Lewis. I would personally like to welcome our recently appointed public members of council, Deidre Brett, who's not with us today, Sally Lewis and John Stashew as well as our newly elected professional members, Eden Thomas, Lisa Nusi, and Claire Ramlogan Silanga. A special thank you to our former public members, Carolyn Brett and Philip Playfair, and our outgoing professional members, Karen Canning, Claudette Leduc, and Barb Borland, our president and council member for 9 years. Barb, where are you? I want to remind everyone here that all of our council meetings are open to all members, and we post the materials online prior to our meetings. As you may know, Council has initiated a comprehensive review of all legislation and regulations that define and inform the practice of midwifery. Our aim is to improve client experience in the healthcare system by removing barriers to delivery of safe, timely, and quality midwifery care. and to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of our programs. Earlier this fall, I received a letter from the Honorable Eric Hoskins indicating the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care's priority of increasing access to health care regarding midwives prescribing controlled substances and ordering additional laboratory tests. We believe that these changes are in the public interest, and we look forward to working with the ministry to improve access to quality care in Ontario, thus benefiting midwifery clients. We will be in touch soon with more information regarding these exciting changes ahead. Now I would like to introduce the college's registrar and CEO, Kelly Dobbin, to come up and speak. She's going to say a few words about our first speaker this morning.
Thank you, Tiffany, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and also on the webcast. I am Kelly Dobbin. I'm the Registrar and CEO of the college, and I'm so happy to introduce to you Deanna Williams, who will be speaking with us this morning. Deanna is a well-respected health regulatory expert, consulting on regulatory health issues in Canada and overseas. She's a regulated health professional herself. She began her career after graduating from the Faculty of Pharmacy in 1976 from the University of Toronto. She practiced as a pharmacist in the hospital setting and in the community setting and as a pharmacy owner. She later joined the Ontario Ministry of Health as a policy coordinator and as acting director of the Drug Programs Reform Secretariat. In 1994, she joined the Ontario College of Pharmacists as Director of Programs. She was then later appointed Deputy Registrar, and in May of 2000, she assumed the position of Registrar. She retired from her position at the Ontario College of Pharmacists in June of 2011, only to launch yet another reinvention of her professional self. She, as you will hear shortly in her presentation, she was appointed supervisor to the College of Denturists after they lost their privilege to self-regulation. She's an active member of CLEAR, which is the Council on Licensure, Enforcement and Regulation, and she served as the Canadian first president of that organization, and she's also received CLEAR's Regulatory Excellence Award in 2010. As if that wasn't enough, Ms. Williams recently graduated from her Chartered Director designation from the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. She has sat on the Finance and Audit Committee of the University of Toronto's St. Michael College, and she's a current member of the Board of Directors of the Haldimand War Memorial Hospital and Edgewater Gardens in Dunnville, Ontario. And since March of 2017, Ms. Williams has been acting as the expert technical advisor to the Ministry of Health, working to inform regulations under Bill 87, which is the Protecting Patients Act. So with that brief introduction, I will welcome you, Deanna, to the stage for your exciting presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to go on record and say that I was 10 years old when I graduated from the Faculty of Pharmacy. Just, I always get kind of nervous when people say what year I graduated, but I actually wasn't 10, but I like to say that. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the privilege of self-regulation that we have here in Canada, not just Ontario, but Canada. So I want to kind of explain a little bit about that and why it is such a privilege. And as Kelly mentioned, I was for almost 2 years a minister-appointed supervisor to a college here that actually lost that privilege and worked very, very hard to get it back. So I want to kind of highlight some of those concerns there for you too. Now, see if I get this. Here we go. So I want to, just for an overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about self-regulation in Canada, what our model is, and why self-regulation means a little something different here than it does in some of the other jurisdictions. Then I want to talk a little bit about our accountabilities, because, as regulators, we hold our members accountable for things, but we have accountabilities as well. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then our responsibility, one of those accountabilities to the public is to regulate first and foremost in the public interest. So I want to explore a little bit what public interest means to a number of different stakeholders, including the colleges, and then, just pull it all together for you and take questions if you have any. So self-regulation, when I say it exists really, truly in Canada only, there's one thing that sets us apart in Canada from every other jurisdiction in the world, and that is that the professions are still allowed and able and expected to elect members from the profession onto the councils of the regulators. Now, in all other jurisdictions, most jurisdictions, they are appointed. So public lay members and professional members together are appointed by an independent body, or by, as in the UK, they're appointed by regulators only after they've been approved by an oversight body. Now, in Ireland, there is the only similarity where, for example, pharmacists still elect pharmacists onto their councils, but they still have to be appointed by the minister. So if you were to run on a platform that the ministry saw was incompatible with the mandate of the college, then you're unlikely to get your appointment. So I wanted just to mention that. Some of the highlights of self-regulation, because there are other jurisdictions in the world who don't get to elect their members onto council, but they still do consider themselves to be self-regulation. There's two things, I think, in this list that I want to highlight. Number one is that we have that privilege to be able to discipline our own. So, for example, in the states where most of the regulators are state regulated, and all of their fees, for example, would go into the state treasury, and then the regulatory board or the state board would have to kind of ask for that money back to do things, and it would be dependent on whether or not what they wanted to do was a priority or aligned with priorities of the governor of the day. The other is with the discipline. I know in the States, many healthcare professionals are disciplined in front of an administrative law judge who may or may not know much about the profession that they're adjudicating. So the ability to be able to discipline our own is a real important hallmark. So I just wanted to mention those two things. And then, of course, we have the autonomy to set and collect and use the fees. So to say as regulatory bodies, this is what we need to do to be effective and credible, and this is how much we need to do it, and this is how many members we have, therefore our fees need to be X. And the ability to have total autonomy about that is a privilege, but in fact it also does heighten our accountability. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our accountabilities in that regard as well. So regulators are accountable for what we do, and I want to look at these through what I'm going to call the 7 pillars of accountability. So there's some structural, there's how we are structured, from a governance standpoint, our external, how we're seen and how we're perceived, program scrutiny, and then the public, the profession, and government. So structural, if you look at structural, what I mean here is we have a professional majority on our councils. And again, that's a privilege. And people will say self-regulation means we have a majority of professional members. Now, I could tell you that in the UK, they have 50% public, 50% professional, and all are appointed by government. In some of the professions, they require the chair to be a member of the public from a perception standpoint, that the chair should be a member of the public. And I will tell you that in Ontario, the only college that has a bylaw that requires their chair or president to be a public member is the denturists. And they put that in, we put that in together when I was a supervisor there, because they had two competing associations at the college in the profession, and it was impossible to get a denturist president where one association wouldn't say that the college was being dominated by the other association. So we decided the cleanest way to go forward was just to put in a public member. And I'm very proud to say that they have revisited that bylaw twice since they've got their privilege back, and they've kept it. So, just the perception that if we really are here to regulate in the public interest, what wouldn't be in the public interest to have a public chair? So just to leave you with that thought. The other is capacity. And in Ontario, we have a very unique model in that almost every profession, with few exceptions, there are some colleges that regulate more than one profession. Pharmacy is one of them. We have pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. Nurses have registered nurses, nurse practitioners, and registered practical nurses. So there are some that do more than one profession. But generally, every regulated professional college, regulates its own profession. And so that is also unique. Where we see a trend globally is in having groups of professions regulated together under one umbrella regulator. So, for example, in the UK, there's Health and Care Professions Council, which regulates 16 health and care professions, including social work. And in Ireland, there's CORU, which regulates 12 different professions under one umbrella. So just to let you know that is also where our privilege comes in. But in order to do that, you have to have the capacity, because we all have to do the same things. And when we look at the accountabilities, you'll see that there is a cost to self-regulation. And the smaller the critical mass of our members, the higher the cost of regulation is per member. And with the denturists, this was one of the issues that caused them trouble. They had 600 members. They weren't collecting enough fees to do all of the things that they had to do. And like I used to say to them, you don't get a break because you have 600 members. You have to do all the same things with 600 people that I had to do in pharmacy with 16,000. So if you're really going to do this, your fees have to be a lot more than they are now. And in fact, the denturists now pay just under $2,000 per member. Looking at internal, this is about how we govern ourselves. And I think the big thing here is that the roles and responsibilities, and again, I think about the denturists, where things can go kind of off the rails and where they have gone off the rails. Everyone has to understand what the roles and responsibilities are. So when we look at external, we'll talk about the importance of everyone understanding the role and responsibilities of the college. But even inside, we need to understand that, the councils are the big P policy, set big P policy. It's like a roadmap, picking a spot on the map and saying, this is where we want to go. And then handing it over to the staff to get you there. So those roles and responsibilities have to be clear and they have to be respected, because if the lines get blurred, then that can cause some real dysfunction within the operations, the internal structure of the college. And again, this was one of the issues that happened at the College of Denturists. The second thing I want to mention here is we have to be absolutely squeaky clean about conflicts of interest and conflicts of role. We have to be able to address them, to declare them, and most importantly, to manage those. And this is something that we saw a lot in pharmacy because, as you can imagine, 90% of pharmacy practice happens in a retail environment. So almost every decision that came before our college council had the potential to impact somebody's bottom line. So the importance of being able to step away from that and not think about our bottom line or what's this going to do to our bottom line. So we had problems, internet pharmacy came onto the scene, remote dispensing, even introducing pharmacy technicians, pharmacists thinking about how is this going to change my model and do I want to do it, as opposed to thinking, is this going to free pharmacists up to do more medication therapy management for the public and it's a good thing. So we have to really address that. And again, this was a key challenge for the denturists. And, you know, all of these things that I mentioned can happen at every college. Every college struggles with conflicts of interest and conflicts of role. Everyone struggles with some kind of governance issues, sometimes roles and responsibilities. But when they all happen at the same time, you end up with a perfect storm, and that's what happened with the denturist. So externally, we have to make sure that we keep our necessary, what I'll call our necessary relationships intact. Now, you know, we make very hard and difficult decisions at the regulatory level. We do. We have the ability to say someone can come into the profession. We have the ability to say you don't make the cut and you can't get a license. We have the ability to strike someone off the register in certain conditions. So we have to be very, very careful. Sometimes we make things because we have to go where we need to go in order to protect and serve the public interest. That may not be always where you want to go as a profession. And heaven knows in pharmacy, many of the things where we said we have to go in this way because this is in the public interest, they weren't necessarily what our profession wanted, but we have to be able to do it. And the most important thing is to do it in a way that keeps our necessary relationships intact. Because if you do all the right things as a regulator, but you lose the trust and confidence of the profession, you lose the ability to interact in a respectful or cooperative way with the association, you lose the ability to work in the way you need to work with the schools, then you're not going to be doing the right, everything will fall off the rails. Does that make sense? So that is really, I think, key. And the other is we have to really be very, very careful about the messages we send. So looking at, you know, websites, looking at our mission statement. And just to give an example, when I went into the denturists, they had their mission statement up on the wall, and it said, you know, the College of Denturists of Ontario promotes and advances the profession of denturism by and doing certain things. Now, anyone see an issue with those words? You know, as colleges, as regulatory colleges, we may lead professions by setting standards. We can inform, we educate, we can guide, but we can't promote in advance. We have to be very, very careful. And also about the things that we do and how we do them. You know, if the messages we send are confusing, then it's not going to serve us well. So I just will explore that a little bit more. And then the third thing is we all have to submit annual reports. Usually, and I have to confess, I haven't really looked at yours, the most recent one, but I can tell you that most of them, I think, are factual. They present a lot of facts, and they're dry as dust. And I would say, what do we do, or what can we do as regulators to go beyond that annual reporting, to say things so that the public will pick it up and it'll tell the public what we're doing to protect their and serve their interests. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that going forward. Now, there we go. Programs and processes. We all have statutory programs and processes, and there are, you know, embedded in various laws, there are a number of ways that we are accountable, so through oversight. So for example, I mentioned we have the ability to register or not register professionals coming into the profession, and our registration practices are overseen by the Office of the Fairness Commissioner, which now exist in 4 provinces in Canada. So Manitoba has one, we have one, Quebec has one, and Nova Scotia has one. We have an expectation that we keep, and you're going to hear about competence because Zubin is here. But we have an expectation in Ontario that, and we have had since 1997, that all of us do not only make sure we have safe and competent practitioners coming in, but that they remain safe and competent throughout the time they're on our register. And that was seen as a leading program in 1997, and many of the other jurisdictions now around the world are saying we need to do that too. Labor mobility, we have the Agreement on Internal Trade. Competition Bureau, and this is probably maybe not so much in your profession, but I can tell you in a number of professions, certainly pharmacy was one of them. The Competition Bureau was always looking at what we did, from our advertising regulations. If there's anything that they saw might reduce competition, they were right on top of us. And then, of course, we all are subject to not only the privacy rules, which are under the Regulated Health Professions Act, but we have now a privacy commissioner in every province that looks at how we treat our confidential information. Now, professional, this is about value proposition. So there's a cost to regulation, and the cost of self-regulation, as I mentioned, can be quite high. And we do have an accountability to you as professional members as to how we spend the money that you give us to regulate you. And so we're accountable to demonstrate that there is value in what we do. We're accountable to the membership, we're accountable to the public. But I want to talk a little bit to tie in 3 of these points, because I really think how we're accountable to you as a profession really isn't that different. There are some elements that are the same of how we are and have to be accountable to the public. And so some of these, of course, we have open meetings of council, which public and professional members can attend. Our discipline meetings, of course, are public, and now there's more expanded information that has been going on our register and will be going on the register. But I think it's important that the consistency and fairness piece is very important, because everybody, whether you're a member of the public, you deserve consistent decisions, which any lawyer will tell you are also defensible decisions. Fairness, if something isn't going forward in a timely manner, everybody's worrying. I know when a complaint came in against a pharmacist, people were very anxious to know where's it going. And if they get the sense that it's in a big black hole and they never hear anything else, then that can erode some of the trust. So in a timely manner, being able to keep people informed, this is where we are in the process, and keeping it both public and professional members very important. And then, of course, fairness. Everyone needs to be treated fairly. And again, when you make a decision, an adjudicative decision, there may always be one party that isn't happy with the decision that's made. And everyone doesn't have to be happy with every decision that's made, but everyone has a right to understand clearly why a decision was made, what the rationale was, and to understand if we want to appeal it, where do we go? And that both applies to professional and public members alike. Government really gives us that privilege, grants us the privilege to regulate ourselves. And it's generally been, without any political interference. That's been our model. But having said that, the pressure on government today, because of media and because of different external factors, I think the pressure on our governments in Canada, but not only in Canada, across the world really, is that we should be putting more oversight onto the regulatory bodies. We shouldn't just be granting them the privileges and then letting them run with it. We should be a little tighter. And the expectation that's placed on us as regulators to act first and foremost in the public interest, and always in the public interest, isn't something that we just all embrace because we think it's a good idea. It's actually something that is enshrined in legislation, and it's extremely clear. So first and foremost in all of our acts is that mandate that we are to act first and foremost in the public interest. So we have that, we come by that honestly. So what does it mean, to regulate in the public interest? And I think, and certainly Richard Steinecke, who some of you know, will say this, that in accepting the privilege to be a self-regulating profession, we, even though it isn't written, and even though it isn't often articulated, I think there's a contract that exists. We actually are signing, if you will, if you're a college registrar, if you're on college council, if you're college staff, we're all signing up to this, that we are going to act first and foremost in the public interest. And it's very interesting because in the UK and in Ireland for CORU, which is the group that still has to go through an appointments process, and the other jurisdictions where all of their members on college councils or regulator councils have to go through an interview process, this is one of the first things that they look for on their application form and then in an interview process. So, you know, they want to find out, do you understand what public interest, and are you able to act? Do you believe that you'll be able to make decisions with the public interest first and foremost? And I have to say that there's a lot of interest in models like this around the world. And, you know, what happens in one jurisdiction often can happen in others. So, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if down the road we see some more attention being put onto who comes onto college councils and whether or not they understand what public interest means. Now, perspective is everything, and when you think about it, every single one of us are members of the public as well as members of the profession, right? So, you know, even though I was a pharmacist, I've been a patient, and so you have that different perspective. You come at it as both sometimes with a background, you know, as a profession, maybe a regulated profession that isn't health, but perspective is everything. And I want to just explain how I think it's so tied and linked to perception. So perception and perspective are very much tied. How people view us is critical. And when you look at risk that we have to deal with, there's operational risk, which we all know about, and there's regulatory risk. That is, are we doing as a regulator all the things we're supposed to be doing, and are we doing them well and effectively? But then there's another reputational risk. And as the denturists will tell you, once you lose your reputation, and you can take years to build a good reputation, it can take one really bad decision to bring it down. And once you've lost it, the denturists will tell you that, you know, almost 5 years later, they lost their privilege in 2012, got it back in 2014. They're still trying to rebuild that reputation that was lost. So, you know, how we are viewed is really important. So asking that question, you know, when we make decisions, if this were to end up on the front page somewhere tomorrow, or what would others think about it? What would the government think? What would the public think? What would the media think? What would other regulators think? It's important to just have that sort of sober second thought. Just to go back to a pharmacy example, some of the challenges we had, when we had a council of 35 people, so we had, you know, 17 professional members and 16 public members and then 2 deans, so it was a large group. But, you know, did we have people from chain pharmacies or independent pharmacies? 2 very different perspectives. Very different perspectives. Did we have owners of pharmacies or were they staff people? And that, again, was very different because the owners were thinking, this is going to affect my bottom line. The staff pharmacists maybe weren't so concerned about it because I'm going to get my salary whether the bottom line is affected or not. So very, very different. And I think that you just have to sort of understand, you know, where your perspective becomes bias. And how can you, what's the difference between the two? So to bring forward a perspective and to say, you know, I work for a chain pharmacy and I know that this decision is going to, our head office is not going to be happy with this because they're going to see that this is going to reduce our revenues or whatever. That's okay. But if you can't leave that at the door and make the right decision and say, but in the public interest, I see that this is an important thing to do. So I'm going to just give you an example from pharmacy, and this was before I went to the college, but it was in 1993, the Tobacco Control Act was coming into pharmacies. Into Ontario. And one of our public members stood up and said, I can't believe you guys let pharmacists sell tobacco. Because you're healthcare professionals. You promote health and wellness on this end of your counter, and on this end, you sell tobacco products, which we know causes cancer. we should be in that Tobacco Control Act, and we should say no tobacco in pharmacies. Now, is anyone here old enough to remember when they used to sell tobacco in pharmacies? And now, I mean, we haven't done this now since 1994, but it was the most divisive thing that the College of Pharmacists, I think, has had to deal with in its history. It was a very, very hotly debated topic. We had 4 Shoppers Drug Mart associates sitting on the Pharmacy Council at the time. Shoppers Drug Mart at that time was owned by Imperial Tobacco. Now, how much of a conflict is that? And the pharmacists who were on were being very strongly pressured by the head office to say no. Don't support this because 25% of our revenues will be lost. And I remember I was working in government at the time, and I remember the chain stores coming in and making that argument. So, that brought a whole number of issues forward to the College Council, the biggest one being conflict of role and conflict of interest, the other speaking with one voice, because we had problems where pharmacists, even though the council made the decision, the ones who didn't agree with it going out and speaking publicly against a decision that the council made. And again, that's a really important governance piece, that's speaking with one voice. So the important thing here is you really have to be able to leave your bias at the door, okay? Bringing your perspective forward is important, and we all come from somewhere, and we all have history and personal experience that may, be valuable to the decision. But at the end of the day, we have to keep our biases, be very careful. Now, the public interest, if we really look at what I think it means to the different groups, I'm just going to sort of go through these, and you can certainly ask questions, or if you have anything you want to add after, feel free. But for the regulator, I think what this means is we take on the responsibility that we're going to ensure that as much as we can ensure, that the professionals that we let in, that we have on our register, are safe and competent, not only at the front end, but the whole time they're on the register. And we're going to act swiftly as we can and as appropriately to deal with things if that isn't the case. So I think that is just a very simple way of saying there's a whole number of other accountabilities, but I think that's where really our role as a regulator is. To the government, the government wants us to do the right things and to do them right so that they don't have the media knocking at their door. When something bad happens or perceived to happen in a regulatory body, a self-regulatory body that is accountable to the public and is a creature of statute, the Minister of Health will be asked about it. And so they want us. It's in the ministry's interest that we do the right things and that we do them right. And so, in granting us that privilege, that's also part of our contract. The public really wants us to have their backs. Some of the public don't even know the colleges exist until they have an issue, right? And then they say, who do I go to? And they find out that there's a regulatory body. But what they want is redress. If something happens, they want to be listened to when they contact us at the college. They want to feel, not to get one of these, chains, press number 1, okay, now press number 8, now press number, they want to get a live person. They want someone to listen and give them acknowledgement that we understand how you feel and to tell them what's going to happen. So they want to know that someone has their backs. And even if it doesn't go, a complaint doesn't go the way someone hopes it will, trying to find out what do they want when they first call in is important. And I know that when I first went to the College of Pharmacists, we had a whole number of cases going to discipline, and the patients at the end would say, well, I didn't want the pharmacist to go to discipline. All I wanted was an apology, or I just wanted my money back, or I wanted some acknowledgement that the service wasn't very good. So, trying to sort of just make sure that we have their backs. And then the professional association I want to talk about in a few minutes because, again, thinking back to the importance of keeping our necessary relationships intact while we do, some of those hard things we have to do, I think is really important. So with the Professional and Advocacy Association, I want to just highlight, I want to speak to the last point first, and that is that it isn't a bad thing to agree, as a regulatory body, to agree with the association. But if you agree all the time, then it could be signals of some problems, because there should be a healthy tension in our relationship, mostly because we have to act first and foremost in the public interest, and the association is a member service or organization that is mandated to act in the member interest. Now, you have to find where the professional interests and public interests intersect. And I'm not talking about cloaking things in public interest, because this is what will be the downfall of a regulator so fast that this is the one thing that we have to avoid. So you can almost always make a public interest argument for things that are clearly in the profession's interest, and we have to resist doing that. But we can look for places where it's equally in the profession's interest that we pursue something, and it's also in the public interest. And the best example for that is continuous professional development and quality assurance. It's just as much in the profession's interest that everyone who's registered is being expected to collectively raise that bar and be competent. It's just as much in the profession's interest as it is in the public interest. So trying to find out where those interests intersect, but recognizing that as an association, you represent the members, you have to go this way, and as a college, you represent the public, you have to go this way. There may be different ways to achieve the goal. Doesn't mean you can't work for the same goal, but you have to be respectful and keeping those lines separate. I don't like the word collaborative, and I get very nervous when people say, oh, we have a very collaborative relationship with our association. I think respectful and cooperative is good. Collaborative, I think you have to be careful, because it could lead, and again, the messaging we use, it could lead others to think that you're too much alike. And everyone needs to respect that there are differences. So I think cooperative and respectful is very important. And I can tell you there were many times when I know our association was not particularly happy where the college went, or a position that we wouldn't take that they wanted us to support. But I think we always had a respectful relationship, and it said you don't have to be happy with what we're doing, but you do need to respect why we have to take this position. And the other point, and it is not such an issue here in Ontario, but in some of the provinces, particularly out west, they have what they call dual object organizations, where the regulator and the association are actually joined together. And around the world, best practice now is to separate them, okay? Not to have clear separation. That around the world, that's considered best practice, so I only mention that. So we all say public interest. If you've ever been to a meeting of regulators, public interest is something that's said all the time. That's what we all say. But we have to understand that when others look at us and we say we regulate in the public interest, there are things that kind of challenge that. Number one is people say, well, then why do you have a professional majority on your councils and on your adjudicative committees? If you're really in the public interest, why don't you have all public members, or why don't you have a public majority? So and again, it's about perspective and perception. The second point, in my almost 20 years in professional regulation in pharmacy, I never ever saw a pharmacist run for election on council saying in their campaign material, vote for me and I will do my utmost to protect the public interest. I mean, I never did. You could have people run for council positions based on, sort of want to give back to the profession, or for different things. Maybe there's certain things that I want to, help, raise the bar in the profession, and things that are not incompatible with our mandate as a regulator. But you hardly ever see people running on a platform that says, I'm going to go on as you put me on, and I'm going to represent the public interest. to the utmost of my ability. And so I think that that doesn't help us when you look at where public trust and confidence might have been lost. Those are some of the things. And, the other that I mentioned, the third point, is the pressure to go forward on things and cloak them as public interest. They're very hard to resist. They're out there. They're very hard to resist. One place where I think you see this a lot, and where I'll just give you again a pharmacy example, is in 2006 to 2008, when the government was looking at access to necessary healthcare services and what could professions do differently, or what could they do more to increase access to necessary healthcare services. And this saw an expansion in the scope of practice of a number of professionals with respect to prescribing, maybe diagnosing, and dispensing even. And certainly in the pharmacy profession, it saw an expansion of our scope. But one of the examples here was giving flu shots and injections. Now, at that time, we had the two deans who were sitting on our college council who said, we don't train pharmacy students to do this. This is not within the training of pharmacy students. Pharmacists are not trained to give flu shots. We had a public member who had been on the College of Nurses who stood up and said, the nurses, there's 160,000 nurses in Ontario who are trained to give flu shots, so there are lots of professionals out there who can. And then we had evidence from Public Health Ontario and Public Health Toronto that basically said there's no evidence that access is the problem. There's evidence that people don't want to give flu shots. They choose not to get them, but there isn't any evidence that they aren't getting them because they can't. So from a college standpoint, we had to not pursue injections and flu shots. We had the dean saying we're not trained to do it. We had no evidence that public protection or safety or access was an issue, so we did not put that in our submission. Now, the association wanted that and a whole bunch of things in the submission because, you think you're going forward on your members' interests and you think this might be our only chance to get things in, so let's put everything we can in there. But it was tricky to navigate through that. And we had to finally say, I'm sorry you don't like this, but we can't go forward on it because with a straight face, we don't have the evidence that we need to say that this would be necessary for the public protection or interest or safety to do it. So it's just an example of, resisting that pressure to cloak it. And you can always go forward and say this is an access issue, but you have to be vigilant and think whether it really is. So again, where professional challenges lie, conflicts of interest, conflicts of role, just to differentiate between the two, and I talked about the pharmacy and tobacco issue. Conflict of interest is where somebody has you actually will benefit personally because of a decision that you're making. So it might be a financial or a personal relationship issue. Conflict of role is where, because of a role that you hold, someone could perceive that you're in a conflict. And where I think you have to be careful, and where we had to be careful in pharmacy, is, if we had a Shoppers Drug Mart associate who was from somewhere up in the north, was on a complaints or discipline panel adjudicating a matter against a pharmacist who worked for Shoppers Drug Mart somewhere else, even though those two pharmacists might not know each other, we would be very cautious about putting them up, because somebody who's a member of the public reading that decision would think, and rightly so, that there's a shopper's associate adjudicating a shopper's associate. So that's where conflict of role comes in, and that's what the difference is between the two. And again, the biggest thing for me on this slide is we really need to constantly earn and keep public confidence and trust. And we do that by the way we interact, by the messages we send, by the relationships we keep, and to a large extent, consulting as well with the public. I don't know that we do this enough. We consult a lot with our members, but we should also be consulting with the public on things that impact them. So some of the things that I think we have to be very cautious about, and we have to really take sort of be really careful to avoid. Reimbursement and employment issues. Again, sometimes it gets to be a little bit tricky, because if somebody goes on strike, if a profession threatens to go on strike, it could be like a real access issue. And we're here to protect the public. So, you can maybe get involved, but you have to be careful how you get involved, and you have to be very careful that we aren't seen to be pumping the pavement for the profession with respect to these issues. Competition issues. One of the things that was really problematic with the denturists, and by the way, if anyone is interested, I think on the College of Denturists website, there still is a copy of the audit report that was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers that led to the appointment of the supervisor in 2012. It's a very interesting read if anybody is ever interested in reading what all the things that can go wrong, because it's a very it's a cautionary tale. But one of the things that was a problem there is that a number of complaints that were coming in, and remember I said they weren't collecting enough money at that college to really do the things they needed to do. They were processing an awful lot of complaints that were really more about competition issues than they were about public. They were against one denturist would file a complaint against another one. And, that really caused them to be spending their money and putting resources in things that were not complaints that had actually to do with patient care. So you have to be really careful about those. And then, again, to the last point, it's okay, and most of us do it. You have conjoint meetings. You have joint meetings with associations together, executives or councils, to share information and sort of talk out some things. But you have to be very, very careful about two things, in my view. One is sending in joint submissions. So send in a submission separately and make it clear that you're sending in a submission as a protector of and serving the public interest. The association sending in their submission. Things in there can be aligned. One can even say, we support what the college is doing, or we don't. You can say, well, we support these things for whatever reason. You may not include others, but keep them separate. I think that sends the wrong messaging. And again, even holding meetings, be very, very careful, you can have meetings, but if it's a college meeting, it should be advertised as a college meeting. And if it's an association meeting, it should be advertised as an association meeting. Doesn't mean that one can't participate in the other's meetings or bring information forward. Happens all the time. But when you advertise a meeting together, it sends confusing messages. So I guess, there we go. So I think we have to be clear and consistent about our messages, communicating decisions really clearly. And again, this is something that is kind of, it's sort of heightened for me because of the work I'm doing on Bill 87. But when I look at some of the, the notices of hearings, the decisions, discipline decisions that were submitted to the government, some of them, to me, and I'm a regulator, I've got a background in regulation, were not clear as to why a decision was made or how they arrived at it. So I think consistently we should be a little more clear in our rationale. And I think always stay on the high road. Sometimes you'll go out to district meetings, and I know you're consulting on new standards. There were some times when we went out on our quality assurance program in the early 90s where sometimes we felt we almost had to run out of the room because people were not happy about it. But you don't sink, you have to always stay on the high road and say, look, we know you don't like it, acknowledge where there are challenges, but keep on why we're doing something if it's in the public interest. So learning from others, the privilege has been lost. I've talked a little bit about the denturists, but the privilege to regulate teachers, the self-regulation of teachers has been lost in British Columbia. It's also been lost in the UK. And that was because of the perception that was very strong that the unions were too strong and that the regulators couldn't resist the pressures from the unions, that there wasn't clear enough separation or respect for the different roles. And most recently, the engineers have lost their ability in Quebec. So, the privilege, I really feel passionate about this. You can tell that we have a privilege here to be able to self-regulate, and it's one that I believe we really want to keep. And to that point, I think all of our professions, our professional members really need to feel that and to embrace it. I can tell you that one of the things that made our work with the denturist, my work with the denturist, so facilitative was that all of the professions, so whether they were on council, whether they were on staff, whether they were with the educational bodies, or whether they were with the two associations, they said to me, just tell us what we need to do to get our privilege back, and we will do it. I'll tell you, that's every registrar's dream, to have a profession say that. And, you know, because of that, I was able to say to them, this is what we have to do, and this is how we have to do it. And they made all the decisions, which is the other thing, which was great. I mean, I could have, as supervisor, I had the powers of the council, I had the powers of the registrar, all the staff, but I only made one decision at the very beginning. They made all the others. And I would help them say, this is why this would be a good decision, this is why this would not be, but it's your decision, what are you going to do? And they made the right decisions. So they believe it's a privilege and they don't want to lose it. And I think what we all need across the professions is that sense that we will do what it takes to keep our privilege of self-regulation. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions. Do we have time?
Yes, we do. Let's see if this is working. Is this microphone working? Not yet? Oh, yes. Okay, I think we have time for 2 questions. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone. And if you need assistance with a microphone, we can bring one to you to the table. So just let us know. Did you? Oh.
How's that? Nope. Test, test, test.
Or I can
test,
repeat it
test.
for you.
Going?
I can repeat it for you, Kelly, if you'd like.
Hello? Oh,
Yes.
That's better. Excellent. Hello, Deanna. My name's Kelly Stadelbauer. I'm the Executive Director of the Professional Association. Such a pleasure to hear you speak this morning. And I would say in my experience as Executive Director in the association, in working with the Registered Nurses Association, as a member of the College of Nurses, in interactions I've had with the College of Midwives and the CPSO, I couldn't agree more with everything that you said this morning, and I think really important key messages for this profession. I appreciated, I could listen to you all day actually about these issues, and really appreciated you bringing your experience from the denturists here, because that is such an instructive story for every profession to understand how that privilege, how it is a privilege to self-regulate and how it can be lost. And I've read that PricewaterhouseCoopers report and agree with you totally that that's a really good read. My question for you is, I was interested in when you talked about cloaking things in the public interest that are actually in the profession's interest. And I guess my question for you is, how would a council know? What are the signs and indicators that something's actually in the professional interest and not really in the public interest, but is being cloaked in the public interest?
Yeah, okay, Kelly, thank you. This is a good question. I mean, I think there are some things that are clearly that are easier for councils. So, for example, when we were looking at the flu shot issue at our council, and, you know, we had all of the things, we were finding that difficulty, that compelling public interest argument wasn't there. And I remember standing up and saying, okay, so where's the interest in this? Like, what is this going to do? And pharmacists would go like this, because they were going to get paid $5 for every flu shot. So we knew, you know, it was clear that there was an interest. So that was one example that was relatively easy. Where I think it gets a little tough is on the expanded scope of practice asks. And especially where I see this the most is where one college will weigh in on another profession's asks with respect to expanded scope. So it is when some profession, another profession is going forward and saying, you know, we believe, now I'll give you an example, I'll use pharmacy as an example. When, you know, we did not go forward and ask for prescribing because we were aware of the sensitivities about that word, you know, about prescribing. But we said pharmacists should be able to modify, adapt, and extend prescriptions within certain parameters because they were doing it anyway through professional judgment. And then it was HPRAC who said, well, if you're going to be doing that, you'd be generating a prescription. Generating a prescription is prescribing, and therefore you should have prescribing. So it was HPRAC that actually said, let's call it what it is, it's prescribing. Now, if you get another college weighing in on that, and we did not because we had gone through all of our, but suppose we got another college that weighed into the government on that and said, you know, a college that had prescribing weighed in on to the government and said, it is not safe for pharmacists to do this. Pharmacists don't know what they're doing. Pharmacists don't have the ability to do it. That would be an example, and yet you do see it at times where one profession will weigh in on an ask of another profession when really the ones who know whether or not, or ought to know whether our professionals have the knowledge, skills, ability, and judgment to do something are the colleges, right? We know what what their knowledge, skills, ability, and judgment are. So we should be the experts in whether or not we can say with a straight face, you know, midwives can do X or pharmacists can do X. But when other colleges, because of their associations, they don't want the competition, start weighing in on those, that's probably the best example I can give. But there's many others, and we have to really drill down at the council table and say, wait a minute, why would we weigh in on another profession's scope if that's not us? And in fact, in pharmacy, we never did weigh in on other scopes. But I think that that's just the one example I can give you. Does that help? Okay.
Thank you for that last thing you were talking about, because I was wondering about your thoughts on how political regulation is in terms of expanded scope, because I think that's kind of our experience of regulation as midwives. And I do know that anytime any profession has come forward to expand their scope at all, the OMA has always tried to block it on the grounds of safety. And so I think that's, to me, an enormous part of self-regulation and regulation in general, and can be
Right.
quite problematic.
Yeah, so, and again, the OMA is mandated to serve and protect the profession's interests. So for the OMA to come forward with that, I don't think would be unexpected, and I think is aligned with their mandate. I think if the College of Physicians and Surgeons were to go forward on it, then that would raise some eyebrows, because, you know, people would want to say, well, where's the evidence? You know, because you have to be very, very careful. And unless you do have evidence, it's better, I think, for a regulator to stay out of other people's scopes. That's my view.
I'll just stand here to say thank you so much, Deanna. That was a terrific presentation. We're so lucky to hear from you today. And I'll just say my new motto is do things right and do the right things. We'll get Spike Lee in here next time. All right. Thank you, Deanna. I apologize. I had another job. I have to announce we're having a 10-minute break. So please use the washrooms. They're marked outside. There's coffee, still tea, and some muffins. And please hurry back because we have another very exciting presentation coming up. Thank you.